It's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Andy Hopper, whose name I've known for a long time, but we've never had the chance to meet, and is in charge of the computing laboratory, as he'll explain. So, Andy, where and when were you born?
I was born in Warsaw, in Poland, of Polish parents, and I went to primary school there, and I came to the UK in 1964 when I was just in the last year of this primary school here in the UK. So my parents divorced, and my mother met an English chap called Hopper, and we came and we lived in the UK, in London, since. So I spent, that was January 64, and I went to local primary school. We lived in central London, and then went to secondary school and on from there.
Can we go just back? You were born in 1953, is that right?
53, a fine vintage.
Oh yes, the same year as Sir Richard Friend, I discovered yesterday. Do you remember anything about your grandparents at all?
I do remember a bit about my grandparents, because I think my real parents didn't get on that well, and my mother was working, so I was looked after by her, but really by the grandparents on her side. I'm not at all familiar with the family on the other side, so I spent quite a bit of time with both my grandparents, and so yeah, I remember them pretty well. But I mean, they're one of these families who were sort of middle class before the war and lost everything during the war, and are doing all right, but were in sort of modest circumstances. Not bad, but not as they had previously.
What did they do? What was their occupation?
Well, my grandfather was an administrative assistant in a church, so he counted the dead.
Counted the dead?
Well, you registered with him.
Oh, I see, yes.
If you wanted to say you're getting married or getting divorced, or not divorced, sorry, getting
buried,
buried, or a new arrival. So he did that, and my grandmother, well, she was slightly older than him, 2 years older than him, and well, she had been part of the family printing business or something before the war, but after the war, I'm not quite sure, I remember 53, so by the time I remember anything, it's late 50s. She was just part of the household and did her stuff at home. And so then I came to the UK in 1964, went to a primary school, St. Peter's Primary School in just by Victoria Station. I couldn't speak English, and I hadn't taken the 11 plus, so and I was quite good at school in Poland, but here, what with the different system and the sort of class of a town of societies, particularly at that time, I ended up being rejected by all the private schools like Latimer and Westminster and all that. They wouldn't take a second look at me. I didn't have an 11 plus, not having taken it even. So I ended up going to a grammar school, but it was right across. We then moved fairly quickly to Putney, and the school was in St. John's Wood. So I ended up going for my secondary education to a school that was a grammar school, and then became a comprehensive school when I went into my sixth form, and that was in St. John's Wood. So I would spend each morning and each afternoon, part of that time, going back and forth across London on the tube. So I know that kind of commuting well.
On your own?
On my own.
Those
were
the days, weren't they?
Those were the days, yeah. Sometimes I had a free bus pass. Now Hopper, my stepfather, he's dead, but he died almost exactly 30 years ago, 1978. About 2 weeks, 3 weeks anniversary kind of thing. But he was a trader, so he had been to Poland to, I think he invented pickled baby beetroot or something, because second crop of a beetroot plant. So he was doing some business in Poland. That's how he met my mother. But he wasn't badly off. He wasn't a rich man, but he wasn't badly off. And as ever, property rather than trading beetroot was, anyway, he had some retail fruit and veg shops, and he was also a wholesaler of fruit and veg on Spitalfields Market, and therefore, he made an okay living, and at various times in his life, I think he was relatively well off. But his first wife died, and he was a cradle snatcher because I think he was 17, 18 years older than my mother. So when we came to the UK, my stepfather, I took his name, I took an English version of my Polish first name, and Drew rather than Andrzej. I retained my fluent Polish, and
to this day,
and that's because my mother would always talk in Polish whenever, at any granularity of time you like. William Hopper, my stepfather, wasn't in the room. So we got into this habit, and in effect she maintained my Polish because we would be using it as soon as he walked out of the room, and it just became casual routine, which I'm very pleased about. And as you can, some of the audience might be able to tell that I still have an accent, and this rather suits me. I like that for all sorts of reasons. Anyway, so went to school in London, and did okay at first, then didn't do so well. Then the school became comprehensive. They, and I guess it's just like vignettes in a thing like this. So there are two vignettes three vignettes I can give you, which relate to school, and I'll give them backwards. So the one that I remember in lowest sixth is that they said to me, you're basically not very able, and you should really do an OND, Ordinary National Diploma, as they were then, not even a higher one, because, so that's interesting. The vignette before that was earlier. The school recommended, and I went to a applied psychologist who gave me a whole bunch of tests, and that formed their advice. So that psychologist.
Did he diagnose you with any known ailment, or?
No, it's just they assessed me and they got it wrong. And the reason they got it wrong is because they completely, I can't quite remember this, but they completely ignored my Polish cultural background in the test they did, and so I came up high. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But so that was the second vignette, that's lowest sixth, but I had said that there were times at school where I did well, so the first vignette, so to speak, in chronological order, would have been that when I hadn't done so well in the second year, Bill Hopper, my father, gave me a financial incentive to do better, and it went something like, you're 23 out of 30 in this class, I'll give you £10 or something like that for the first 10 places you go up, and then £2 for each place after that. I came first the following year, so I collected the whole shooting match. So I don't know if that was and you know, he was a little bit business oriented, even in schooling, and you know, the incentive and all that. So maybe that's a little indication of what was later on a little more business oriented interest I've had. But anyway, the bottom line is I did okay, so I'm not one of these stellar in everything, couldn't go wrong. No, it's up and down like a yo-yo in the measured stuff anyway. So up in Poland, down at first in secondary school here, then up in the middle of the secondary school, then down in the early part of the sixth form, then sort of halfway up to towards the end. I didn't get particularly good A-levels, and the school had gone comprehensive, and while that has a lot of merit, in fact, when I look back on it, not many went to university from that school. In the early part of my schooling, the grammar school was sending people to university. by the time it became a comprehensive and second year of comprehensive, that was much more unusual. Although actually, in retrospect, it was quite a okay school, really. Anyway, so I did mid-good, not stellar, but not bad, and I applied to university and ended up at University of Wales, Swansea.
Can I just go back over two things? One is your parents' character, and that could have come much earlier, but it doesn't too much matter about your adopted or your mother's second husband, but was your mother someone who you were close to?
Yeah, reasonably close to. I mean, it's a Polish cultural background where you tend to be a little more sticky with each other. And I don't know about my real father. I believe he's some kind of academic. But my mother, she's sort of a fairly ambitious woman with attitude, not particularly pushy in the sense of you got to do like this, but attitude, opinion, and everything, you know, and perhaps that formed a perspective. Education in that culture is very important. Achievement, attainment is pretty important. So yeah, I guess that was...
The other thing I was going to ask you about your school, were there any subjects that you were particularly getting interested in?
Well, again, it's a mixed bunch of things. I've always enjoyed the more mechanical engineering train sets, if you like, perspective of things. But in the school, it was good and bad. So some of the things I ended up not kind of being encouraged to have been a disadvantage. So they kicked me out of history very quickly. So my knowledge of straightforward kind of chronological, or any other history for that matter, is weak. And they put me into woodwork rather than something else, which I can't even remember what the choice might have been. So I just carried on, and it was fine in terms of pull onto subjects. The electronic side of things, the computing side of things, in the late 60s and very early 70s, I went to university in 71, so I would have been a sixth former, 69 till 71. That was just after landing on the moon. That was just starting to happen, and I clearly had some interest in that stuff. You couldn't, one couldn't get a computer at home at that time, so you had to go to university to do a computer. And in school, you'd have had, and I did have sort of electronics kits at home, actually not at school, at home, where I fiddled around with that sort of stuff. So my educational context was not one where I would find a subject and then I'd be pulled up by the school or the circumstances. It was more jolly good, let's just get on with it, nice, keep going, and then interests as they came along, were kind of factored in as the parents best could and the school could, but they weren't sort of privileged, and this has nothing to do with wealth, it's just the way it was.
Were there any teachers who influenced you particularly at the school, or not?
Not that I can recall. I don't think they were particularly bad or good or anything. They were nice enough people, as I recall, but it wasn't a kind of fully engaged situation. I was commuting a long way, so that essentially none of my school friends were available nearby to where I lived.
What about sort of games or music or hobbies or?
Well, I was a cox at rowing, and they didn't tell me that in those days that would help get into top university. It wouldn't today, but in those days. So the school was actually the school was called Quintin School. It was set up by Quintin Hogg, who did the Polytechnic in London, and so it was a sort of polytechnic school and had access to the Polytechnic's sports ground and rowing facilities on the Thames at Mortlake. So in terms of sports, there was a sports ground, there was tubs and rowing and coxing and all this sort of stuff. And as it happens, that wasn't too far from where we lived, so actually there was a little bit of a connection there. But I wouldn't emphasize that too much. I'm quite sporty. I like my sports, like many people. I was for what it's worth, in both the University of Wales and this university's skiing team of all things. So it's not the most important or leading of sports, but nevertheless, I did a little bit of that sort of stuff over the years. And I'll come back in a minute about being a PhD student. But no, I mean, it sounds very bland. The main thing about my education from that point of view was central London. As I grew up, we had a good time. I had some friends. We used to go to discos in Soho. I used to get a bit of money for handing out tickets on the street. My friends in school were savvy London lads. Not East End, it's North London, even though I lived South London. And that was, very real world education, and the comprehensive school went as part of that. All sorts of people. There was not too far from Kilburn, so there was Irish, North London, Jewish people, some coloured skin, it's all kind of stuff, and that's quite good in a way. My children now go to the state system for similar sort of reasons. I think the school is rather better in many ways, Sawston Village College in my case, but I look at it as a much broader thing rather than a narrow, here is your subject, just get on with it. Now whether some other existence would have been better, I have no idea, who cares? That's the way it was. And what it did set me up is, at the time when computing was starting to get going in a sort of more popular level, less exclusive, more accessible level, it did set me up to apply to university. I applied to Manchester, I applied to Lancaster, I applied to Swansea. I didn't get the marks for Manchester or Lancaster, but I think it was C's I got, and I can't remember quite. But anyway, the professor at Swansea, I phoned up and I said, I think I've got one lesson you offered, will you take me? He said yes, and that was that. And as it turns out, that was fantastic. And the reason it was fantastic was because, one, it turns out I am quite okay at this computing, because ever since that day I've been top of everything in some broad sense. It suits me, and then it's easy to be, so I always got firsts after that, everything else just went straight through. So one is, it suits my talents, and two, this guy, a fellow called David Aspinall, he was from Manchester himself, but he got his first year at Swansea, so he came along and set up a course called Computer Technology, and I'm Professor of Computer Technology, and Morris Wilkes, Professor of Computer Technology, and this is, name's the same, but it wasn't, it wasn't designed like that. But it's correct, so that course in Computer Technology was a combination of electronics, computer science, and a little bit of, what now would be called enterprise, except then it was called a little bit of macroeconomics, read your Lipsy, a little bit of P&L accounting, this is what a balance sheet looks like, that sort of thing. And this is 1971. So this guy put together something which was, it's not quite joint honours, but a very appropriate course, which today is as, I don't think it exists anymore, but would be as fresh as you can imagine, and at an early stage in the subject's development where, you could, for the first time, get computers, but it was still, microprocessor just coming, that sort of stuff. So it was still early, that it was all to do, all to discover, all to fiddle around, all to play with, all to everything. Train sets. And that was fantastic. And then Gower, Swansea, wonderful, beaches. And then, socially, having been a London person, I didn't exactly find it difficult to have a good time in Swansea, because I wasn't a retiring chap from some more distant part of, or less experienced chap from some more distant part of the UK. I was a downtown London kind of person, having a good time in Swansea. So that was very good, and I sort of trying to assess my perspectives a little. So I remember, for example, the year between, was it that year or was it the year after? I think it was maybe between my first and second year. It might have been between school and first year. A friend of mine got a car, drove to Iran and back.
With you? To Iran.
Iran, yeah. So, right across Europe, Turkey. He was Iranian, so we basically went to visit his family and then back. In the Shah's days. Next year I went off by myself and got myself to Brazil and toured by myself all over Brazil. So I was, it was all good stuff when I think about it. And my son is 13, and just this week he's on his first trip in Germany with his school, but I'm thinking, God, he's behind the curve compared to me, how times have changed, and I'm sort of encouraging kind of perspective on this, but somehow all that seemed to be easier than that. So that should give you a little sort of compressed summary, that I ended up being with the right course, in the right place, right course being suiting what I can do, and also it turns out a very good timely course for the way the world would turn out. It's a good launch pad, but rather different to Cambridge, because I hadn't seen a gown till I turned up in Cambridge, nor a black tie, I think, or anything of that sort. Anyway, so I did that in Swansea, and then I flunked it into Cambridge because I did well in my class at Swansea, but I was still this keen skier, so really what I was thinking about is how can I combine postgraduate studies, and I always had some idea that I would do postgraduate, that seemed to be a good thing to do, with skiing. So I was planning to go anywhere that's close to a big mountain.
So Cambridge was the obvious place.
So I didn't apply here at all. I could have done, by then, my marks and all that stuff was okay, but I applied to Lausanne, I applied to Grenoble, and I was hoping to go to one of those places. My French isn't too bad, so that wouldn't have been a particular inhibition. But I didn't hear anything from these people. So this Aspinall guy, who was the professor, my professor in Swansea, he said, well, it's getting on a bit. It's early July. The timing of this comment to anybody who does admissions would be well understood. It's early July. You better apply, because the UK SRC, as it was, funding system, these things have been allocated, and unless you get one in the UK, it will be too late. Why don't you try Cambridge, he says, and Cambridge was a professional connection, but Manchester is the other sort of early centre in the UK of computers, and he wasn't in that first generation, but he was in the second generation of people who did computing in the UK, in his case in Manchester. I know this fellow called David Wheeler in Cambridge, and he'll be all right, he'll suit you well, go and talk to him. I had a little car there, and so if I went driving down here, we're in Cambridge, to Cambridge in the early part of July 1974, and knocked on the door, so to speak. Well, I'd arranged an appointment, but they said, okay, come in. And I had an interview with Maurice Wilkes and Roger Needham, with a couple of my savvy London friends, who I've kept in contact with to this day, having a cup of tea in Rose Crescent. And then the next day after that interview, they took me. And I would like to think that it was through great brain power and brilliance, but I fear the reality is that they actually had studentships and somebody had dropped out, and so they had a spare studentship going. So basically the next person walking in through the door who was half capable, they would have offered it to. So they offered it to me. I said, yes, thank you very much, and now it's a life sentence. So so in a sense it's fluking it, but who knows, there it is. So that's how I ended up in Cambridge, and I duly actually did get some offers from these other places near mountains, but by then I had committed and all the rest of it. And of course Cambridge is a good place, and I was slightly bemused, scratching my head slightly, but anyway, it turned out that I had ended up here. But there we are. So I came here in 1974 and started my PhD, and I'm still wearing short trousers, but the computer, this was at the computer lab with David, well actually Roger Needham initially as my supervisor, but that was a default setting, and then David Wheeler became my supervisor in the Easter term of 1975. But there are sort of little connections which I could make, vignettes again. So first of all, well, actually just factual, that the computer lab has had a tradition of building things, and they were actually at a stage where they weren't building anything. So all the PhD students were doing this, and I turned up and I said, I like to do a bit of soldering. So they set me up with a little actual hardware bench, and everybody felt a little happy because, a little happier because it sort of, this little morsel came up and was doing something that had its roots in the computer lab's earlier things. So yeah, people say, oh, very nice, a PhD student solders, doesn't just do this. So that was good. Then secondly, I had a ski instructor's ticket license. So actually I did two things. I went skiing and I disappeared off, I seem to recall, for December and January of that year. So that, they found that a little bit odd. They were all very nice about it, but I was ski instructing in the Alps. And then the other thing I started doing was gliding. So in the autumn of '74, I went to the Cambridge University Gliding Club, which was at Duxford, and started doing all this sort of stuff. And I've carried on flying ever since. So so there we go. So that's how I got into Cambridge. That's how it all sort of got going, and that's how. On the Cambridge Ring you mentioned, so that was one of the projects that I have done in the past. My main one as a PhD, but I was just the boy on that. I mean, that was done by David Wheeler, Maurice Wilkes, Roger, others. I did my bit, but I was a PhD student. And,
is that what your PhD was about?
Yeah, well, we were doing, I was doing it in a PhD student sense, rather perhaps more opinionated and thinking that I was making a bigger contribution than I was, but nevertheless helping to the basic design, and that was in the days of no local area networks. So it was, let's design a local area network, in other words a faster network that can connect these machines. Morris and David Wheeler set out the design. I helped to finesse various bits. Ethernet was just coming along. We hadn't heard about it at first, but then they published a paper, and we thought, that's rather important. Similar sort of idea done in a different way. And my PhD was, it's called Local Area Computer Communication Networks, plural. So it was, I made the observation, I guess, that there are a great number of similarities in all these networks, and we can argue the detail, but actually you can design and implement them in, with the same sort of hardware. And then I came up with it's a paper design, although it turned into better things later, for a single chip. So one chip and a chip level implementation of any of these networks using this proposed hardware. So my thesis wasn't the Cambridge Ring, because I wasn't, it was, look, Cambridge Ring, here's my contribution, but now you should sort of try and broaden that design process and so on. So that was 1977, that my 3 years were up, but what happened was these were sort of good times, and this idea of a single network chip for all these networks was, even at that point, I'm not quite sure, Ethernet had just been published, but they were obviously working on a chip and so on. That was a good idea. So again, the way I became a research assistant is, well, it's chance, sort of chance. Anyway, so I was going around explaining to many people how the Cambridge Ring worked, because there was a lot of interest in it, and I guess Maurice and Roger and David Wheeler got bored with doing it. So I would be the sort of gaffer who would do that.
And you came to our department, into our basement, and set it up for us.
Yeah, well, because we had the big long fibre link that GEC gave that went across from the Computer Lab Museum site over to your neck of the woods, and then the cable would go down the stairs and along down there, and I remember grovelling around there, making the interface work and all that sort of stuff in such topology, yeah. It was a Nova, I think it was a
The
Nova.
Nova, that's right.
A Nova computer. It wasn't a PDP-11 at
No.
all, I recall. Nova, which was slightly unusual one to have. Oh yeah, so, but as I was cruising around talking the talk, I bumped into one of the senior people at the Rutherford Labs. And basically this person, David Thomas is his name, he said, how about me giving you some money to do this? That is, take this chip thing beyond your PhD. Oh, I said, so I turned up back at the computer lab, went to see Morris. I said, Morris, I just met this chap. And he says, have some money, and why don't you work on this? So Morris thought about this, I guess, for about a microsecond and thought, oh, what a splendid idea. So essentially I turned up with my own money, so to speak, to carry on as a research assistant. So then I carried on as a research assistant on this money, doing this chip, and then that developed, there was a Department of Trade and Industry, or whatever it was called then, I think called the Advanced Computer Technology Scheme, which was basically a funding scheme, which again put some money into this. I had a little management board which was managing me as a research assistant. So in other words, I didn't finish my PhD in 77, my time was up. I finished it in Easter 78 because I started doing some of this other stuff. And then Hopper died, which is why I remember it, in June 78, so I didn't actually take my PhD till September 78. Hopper had a heart attack and honked out in his chair in Putney where we lived. But yes, it's 30 years, just about now. So that's how I got into both Cambridge as an employer, as an employee, beg your pardon. Cambridge University as my employer. And I guess 31 years are up on the old pension. And got into this business of doing chips and got into this business of doing networks. And that's kind of, those were good times to do it. Although again, it's competitive. One thinks, oh, good times, early days must have been easy. Well, no, because the competition was Ethernet in the shape of three companies, DEC, Intel and Xerox had got together. So there was me over here, my little management committee, and there was Intel, Xerox and DEC, and actually 3Com, a startup that Bob Metcalf did, over there. So it was competitive, but nevertheless, in retrospect, as compared to today, where what you do in university as a computer technologist is a little more challenging to work out, appears to be anyway. That caused a bunch of technology to exist in Cambridge, which later on it became a variety of companies, all kinds of things. But the roots go back to that, and essentially, if I can summarize that, this is kind of important in an archival record point of view, because these chains aren't obvious, but the chain goes as follows. So, Computer Lab's doing the Cambridge Ring. The first time local area networks are sort of starting to be done. Chip version. Chip version, let's find somebody to make a chip. Okay, we happen to use Ferranti, or let's use Ferranti. They've got some hardware but don't know how to design it. So we try and design it essentially by hand and go, oh, we need some tools. We need some CAD, computer-aided design tools, to make these chips. Let's have a CAD project. Okay, so we start a CAD project, which is making the tools, which will make the ring chips. Fine, we'll carry on with that. Meanwhile, companies are starting home computing, so CPU Limited, which is what Acorn was a trading name, essentially, until it became a public company. So a consulting and then a home computer company called CPU starts and says, ooh, let's use some of these chips, and there aren't any tools, but we can make a better computer at a cheaper price by using these chips that are the same as used in the computer lab for the brain. Oh, that's a good idea. So the BBC Micro having chips inside it is rooted in that directly. And Sinclair's competition is also, well, it's just as a result of competition, but it's the same chips that were in there. So it's not that there was a technology flow. which is why they were a little bit behind us, but not much in the technology sense. And then the BBC Micro had a network in it. It wasn't the ring, it was another network, but that's directly, again, rooted in this university work, because network was that I had a lot to do with on the Acorn machines. So slightly different, but actually was the best of both worlds. It was a low-cost implementation of an Ethernet, but using some of the experience from the ring. And file servers and so on. So that whole system, and by that system I mean the BBC micro networking computer system and networking system, had networks in it. So when Bill Gates came along, we showed it to him. He said, "What's that?" We said, "A network." He said, "What's that?" You know. So we were ahead of the curve, for example, with respect to him. Okay, and then being plugged into the world design cluster, if you like, or system. We is Acorn.
You were one of the founders of Acorn.
Co-founders. I was the third one. So there were two.
Herman Hauser,
Chris Curry, and me. But I'll explain that.
Right.
They're the three shareholders and the three directors of CPU, which is actually the underpinning company. But in Acorn, we started doing a microprocessor design, which has now become ARM, the world's largest supplier of microprocessors to mobiles, and like 90% share. Backtrack. So in Acorn, we needed CAD, so we purchased the CAD from the university that was being done as part of that.
Was that CAD?
No, just CAD for chips, because we had that project, if you recall, I mentioned that we had the project for this, because the Ferranti thing couldn't be designed, so then we designed CAD. So Acorn purchased that, developed it itself, and that gave it its underpinnings to be able to design a microprocessor in the first place. So that's where that came from. And now ARM is super, ultra, mega successful. And then another, I'm sort of fast forwarding, but these are important lines. Then another Cambridge successful company called Virata, which is now much later in the 90s. But again, that's a networking company, DSL, the digital subscriber for the home, broadband to the home, chip company. But again, it's just, so it's a networking company that uses a chip for its implementation. That's, you know, the next lower cost chip that went gangbusters and had about 40% of the world's DSL market for those sort of chips. And again, that's a direct, there were some higher speed networks in between, one or two bits of technology, but it's a direct line of technologies. So that whole business of just going back to the roots of the ring, chip for ring, a single sort of perspective on all networks of that kind can be done one way or another, and then jinking that into, you know, like businesses, but, you know, sort of high-tech ventures of various kinds, whether for the Acorn, whether for Virata, whether for ARM. Actually, even wireless is another line where it's more recent. That all has its roots in all that stuff.
Amazing. It's the spring from which so many rivers have flowed. Yes. I was just, before we go on along those lines, you mentioned several distinguished computer scientists, and it's always nice to have a vignette of them as well. Let's start with the oldest one, perhaps Maurice Wilks.
Well, Maurice, so he is my professor. Well, I've got David Wheeler and him are my professors. David Wheeler in the supervisor sense, and Maurice in this sort of slightly grander version of my professor. Well, he carries on relentlessly, and to my amazement, with only a brief gap, his professional relationship with me goes back to 74, so that's 34 years, crying out loud. And that, you know, he was just before retirement when we started. So he still comes in, he's still got the office next to me in the computer lab. When I was running the industrial lab, Olivetti Research Limited, he had his office next to me there, he participated in that. And the man is driven. So we all have this disease of hunger for success, for impact, for continual desire to achieve something with proper intellectual basis and all that. And he's the extreme version, so I refer to him in the kindest possible way I can, but I call him my intellectual dentist, because, you know, to this day he drills, and it's good for me, I know, but it hurts a bit, and you can't talk about football with the man, right?
But he'd already, as you say, he was nearly near retirement, and he'd already, there's a moot point, but been in charge of the first successful working programmable computer EDSAC. So he was a very famous figure already when you came
Very
to
much so. I mean, he was demigod, and he's even more of a demigod, and he's got every prize and so on. But it's just curious that, so I came in 74, he retired in 1980, so he was 61, I guess, or 59 or something, I don't know what time. 61, I guess, 67 he would have retired. And what, 34 years later, he still comes in, says, excuse me, Andy, but what do you think about, you know, fix on something technological? And I go, oh gosh, and, you know, I have to bootstrap myself up and think about it. And I said, I'll come back to you about that, Morris, because he wants a proper answer. He doesn't want this off-the-cuff stuff. And I think about it, have a quick little read, talk to my friends, and I said, Morris, my view is this, right?
What about the Needhams, Roger and Karen?
Roger and Karen, yeah. Roger was part of the distributed system work on the ring. Of course, he did many other things before I started to do my little bits and pieces in Cambridge. So, from my telescope, it starts there, but obviously there were other things. Well, he's a great systems guy, and somehow he can. It's a combination of philosophy, logic, and parallelism and optimization, and he's able to hold all this stuff in his mind and optimize. A good leader, very good leader. He had this effect on me. Karen a little more distant, although I've had much more to do with her until she died just recently, because she was on my case as head of department in fundraising. And that was a very good thing to have, because she kept on saying, why aren't we doing this, why aren't we doing that, the foundation, and she personally made contributions as well, so that that's going, made the first foundation contribution to our fundraising campaign. And then she was a trustee of various things like Triplo Trust, which is Swinnerton Dyer, and that trust has made a contribution. So, you know, she was, that's my immediate memory of her. And then the more general memory of what she did was help a great deal with this very important computer lab thing, which is the breadth of the place. You know, people talk about interdisciplinary things, and I've taken to saying the department is because it is in today's language. It's just so broad, and she was an FBA. We always used to say how wonderful it is that in the computer lab we got fellows at Royal Academy of Engineering, Royal Society, and the British Academy, right? Jolly, jolly good, a bit unusual, and that's the breadth, that's the interdisciplinary. And so I think of her as, for example, doing the language stuff, and some of it I understood, and then she went off into lands which I didn't understand, but it was very good that she was part of the computer laboratory. And the two of them, of course, were quite good sparring partners, and they wouldn't hesitate or feel embarrassed about having a robust discussion in front of others about something.
The name she kept seems somehow symbolic, Spark Jones.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So they were, you know, so I'm not sure about vignettes, but I remember moments when Roger got his chair, we had a great party and everybody was very happy. And of course he went off to do Microsoft, and since I used to run an industrial lab for many years, that was interesting as well, and we talked about how to run a lab. The Microsoft situation was different. Mine was a much more independent entity, less corporate. His was a little more corporate.
This is Olivetti.
This was Olivetti, but nevertheless, there were, we would talk about how to run a lab and compare that, our perspectives to people who, to the digital and Xerox PARC and other places, distinguished labs, and how we might, achieve even more than they did and this sort of thing.
And what about David Wheeler as the last, your supervisor?
Well, I saw rather a lot of him because he was my supervisor, and you build up a bond with your PhD supervisor in a way not to with others, or at least it's a special bond. So he was, for the first year it didn't matter I went skiing because I couldn't understand what the guy was talking about anyway. So it was such a gap between what I could offer and where he was in the sense of training, just his background, having done major bits of the EDSAC and the programming bit and all that. So that whole raft of experience, and therefore getting to the point of me posing a question, him giving an answer, me not understanding the answer, and then working out the whole context which made for the answer, took some time. I eventually did it, and then eventually I could talk his talk, right? So I didn't need all that time to work it all out, but I'm saying it took me a year, really a year, to do it. He was very, very smart cookie, so he was good at the details, so he could normally a supervisor can't out-detail the student, but he could out-detail me. Used to scribble on little sheets of paper, yay big. So David Wheeler scribblings, and in our archives, in my personal archives, I got some of that stuff. And he always felt there was already a bit of paper for everything you could conceivably ever ask, if I would scribble on and give him the answers. There was some truth in all that.
He worked with Peter Swinnerton Dyer, didn't he?
That was before my time, but so he was very special, and it would be difficult in the new world today for somebody like that to exist, because promotion, recognition, distinction are more formulaic these days.
He was just a lecturer, was he?
Or he became a professor, but he was an FRS and published about 3 things in his time. So maybe it's still possible. I was really thinking more of the university system. It would be more difficult for him to be a professor these days. Probably possible, but that would be too bad. But then he had, so I would have a barbecue at home sometimes, and he would turn up on the back of his daughter's motorbike, and his daughter wore black leather, so that was always an amusing thing.
You could talk about football.
Well, yes, there was no sort of territories. It's not that with Wilkes there were no go territories, there was just nothing to talk about, whereas with Wheeler, he didn't know much about it, but he could talk about it, say, motorbike, Broom Broom, Hells Angels, whatever it was. I can now visualise those moments when he would turn up my drive on the back of his daughter's bike.
Tell me more about your flying, because that's obviously meant a lot.
Yeah, well, flying is, so I started that gliding thing when I was a first year PhD student, and did a fair amount of that, and that takes a lot of time, so I really didn't do much PhD studenting between my skiing and my gliding. But I like that sort of stuff. I have very good spatial awareness and very good spatial and geographic, if you like, physical geographic memory. Very, very strong, and extremely strong sense of direction, and I like tinkering with things, and I quite like mechanical things. So if you put all that with flying, it matches rather well. So, because an aeroplane, it's got mechanical systems, it's got electrical systems of various kinds, it's got hydraulic systems of one or several kinds, it's got oxygen systems, it's got an engine, it's got fuel, it's got vacuum, it's got pressure, so you can fiddle up to a point. You mustn't over-fiddle because you get into trouble yourself, but so that's good. Then the weather and all that plays a part. So all these things are very attractive to me. And so trouble with flying is it's pretty expensive. So you got to make a few bob, because on a research assistant, or dare I even say professorial salary, you can't do it. So fortunately I've made a few bob so I can afford it. And yeah, so I am as professional as I can about my flying. I've just under 5,000 hours flying experience right now, so that's for a punter. That's quite high.
You fly a Cessna, is
I
that
fly
right?
a small Cessna, single engine Cessna, with 6 seats, so it's on the bigger side of small aeroplanes, but it's still small. I forget it.
And you've got a runway at your house.
Yeah, I've got the airstrip at home in Little Shelford. So it's essentially a piece of grass which is 600 yards long, and you start pedaling at one end and you...
I've probably seen you up there from time to time.
But you'd be surprised what you can do. So this particular, so it goes regular rating, then you can have an instrument rating. So if you've got an instrument rating, you can fly bad weather, good weather at night, during the day. And then even with small aircraft, mine is really at the small end. Well, it's about the largest you'd want on a grass strip with safety. So it's really, the two things go together. Otherwise, your plane gets bigger, you have to keep it at a bigger airfield. And if you haven't got an airstrip at home, that's fine. But if you've got an airstrip at home, the idea of having an airstrip at home but then going to an airport is slightly odd. But with my one, it's got various sort of features, turbocharging and so on. So you'd be surprised. I can take off, and I can go to Poland, for example, straight from home, no problem.
Gosh.
And in Poland, also sometimes in a small place rather than a big place, and that works fine. And in my travels, which I like very much, so I've done quite a bit. So I like it. It's adventure travel. I don't do aerobatics, and I don't do racing. But I do adventure flying, by which I mean you travel. It's like the rough guide to flying the world, kind of thing. And there's a great thing about flying, which is you'll appreciate this as an anthropologist, is that so you go to land and you go somewhere, and normally it's small, and you're just much entertainment for them as they are for you. So you go to some place and they go, and you've got to land and talk to somebody, because there's a little airfield and there's somebody minding it and so on, and you can't ignore that, and that's great. So they look at you and kind of immediately want to know what you're doing there, why on earth, and what's going on. But that means you can start talking to them, and they normally have a bit of English, or quite good English even. So you can gel with people, and these are out-of-the-way places, so this entertainment is quite attractive for them. So that means they point you, they help you, and so on, just by the circumstances. So for example, I've flown all over the Arctic, and the whole of the Arctic is like that. So you go to some little place in northern Canada. When I say northern Canada, I mean northern Canada. I don't mean just north of the border. I mean 500 miles from the North Pole. In that case, it's military or a Canadian weather station, and they go, "Hello, we've been here 3 weeks. Where have you come from?" "Greenland." "What?" And off you go. So I've travelled in that sort of way, and I like it. And I've had the good fortune to be, for example, all over South America in my plane, all over Africa in my plane,
Gosh.
to the States probably a dozen times, Canada, all over Canada, everywhere, all over Europe, all over. So with a bit of luck, I'll take it to New Zealand because we're going for 3 months in New Zealand next year. So it's adventure flying. But when I say Africa, that means so if you take, say, Namibia, that means you fly the Skeleton Coast, which is 700-800 miles at 50 feet all the way down, right? Pictures, seal, shipwreck, kudu, Hannibal. 2 hours later, it's still getting. All right, so it's that sort of stuff.
Fascinating.
And then because I do comms, and I've got all the comms in the world, so I can always phone my mum. I've got all the connectivity out of there you could ever wish for. So in terms of getting the weather, in terms of contact, but from a safety point of view and just social point of view, it's all there. So it's not heroic in any way, it's just right.
You read Flight to Arras
No,
by Saint-Exupéry, which is on the sort of meditative philosopher during the Second World War. It's a very beautiful book. He wrote Le Petit Prince, but this I think is an even better book. I think you'd enjoy it. In Penguin or something. Flight to Arras by Saint-Exupéry. That almost converted me to flying. Talking of long distances, you won't have flown there, but there's a lot happening, and I spend time in Japan and China and India. Do you spend any time in those parts of the world?
I haven't spent any time at all really in India. I'd like to, just the way it's turned out. China a little bit more, but with the fast changes, and it's really on a business basis, although I've been on a lecture tour with in China with some friends like Gabriel Horn and
yes, I briefed him on that tour.
And Tom Blundell and but my experience of China is from a business perspective, where one or two of my companies have tried to sell in China, and with China, its cultural gap is, for me anyway, so great that whenever I think I understand what's going on, I immediately pinch myself, because obviously I'm hallucinating or dreaming, God knows what, because it's all going to be changed, it's a mirage. So I haven't gelled with China in any substantive way, although I've been there quite a few times. I went there when I got married, because my wife is Alison Smith, she's Professor of Plant Biochemistry here. That was nice, 1988. I went to China first time I went on a little round the world trip in between being a PhD student and a research assistant. 1977 when it first opened. Anyway, Japan, that's rather more frequent over the years, for one reason or another. And there the cultural gap, I find, is still not bridgeable, but at least I don't have to pinch myself in the sense of reminding myself that I understand nothing. At least I feel I've got at least the beginnings of engagement with the Japanese. But at the moment I'm developing links with Africa, actually. At the moment, in my own work, and this might interest you, and you might tell me how I'm getting this wrong, but the good times, in the sense of arrogant times with technology, have moved on. And so everybody takes the kind of things I do and others like me do for granted. That'll just carry on, that it's all fine, this technology will continue, and so on and so forth. And that may not be the case, but at the same time more and more people are encompassed by it, and actually have a view, and maybe even, and I use the word advisedly, need the technology to maintain their standard of living or develop their standard of living without affecting the planet in as substantive ways as predecessors, in other words, us, have done. And so I'm building links for non-charitable reasons, for professional business reasons, with Africa, actually. Because shortly, in about a month's time, I'm off to Cape Town, I'm off to Kampala. And the reason to build it, they're all personal links, is and I've had a policy of trying to admit PhD students from the developing world for some time. They have to be good enough, but then I'll so I've got a fellow from the Cameroon. He's actually done well, he's just got a research fellowship at Trinity, but he's got an interesting perspective. Tanzanians, Kenyans. So they have to be professionally very good, but then they give a perspective on these technologies. So for example, you say, oh, here you guys in Africa, in some part of Africa, you're getting this mobile infrastructure, we're going to design a nice, cheap, robust phone for you. You tell that to them, they say, bugger off. Last thing we want is a special phone for Africa which is robust and cheap. We want the very latest Nokia model, because if there's one thing I want to be able to afford, and it's nothing else I want to have the best Nokia phone. Get lost. And so that, now that's more sort of design, social perspective, but now that filtered from an engineer coming back at me saying, look, you're being a Wozniak having this engineering perspective. they take it for granted, they assume the technology is coming and they want it like this, and unless you have it like this, you're going to be a loser, is very important, even though I think the technology isn't necessarily coming and it isn't necessarily driven like that, but actually in today's world, to get it accepted and to satisfy my desire for impact, I need to have that. And then also it's a good excuse to travel, and Africa's great because there's no jet lag, so you know I prefer that than anything like this. I've just come back from the US and just yet again jet lag. So you know that's the core reason for Africa.
That's a nice reason. Yeah.
That's realistic.
Do you know Neil Turrock's work on setting up mathematical institutes in AIMS, African Institute for Mathematical Sciences? And they've just had 5 Africans brought through this program. Well, you'll see it on the website when his interview goes up, but it might tie in with your interests.